Last Friday, two members of the climate activist group Just Stop Oil threw Heinz tomato soup at a Vincent van Gogh painting at the London National Gallery. The activists say their goal is to, quote, ensure the government commits to ending all new licenses and consents for the exploration, development, and production of fossil fuels in the UK.
Joining us now to discuss whether this is an effective tactic is Eric Levitz, senior writer at New York Magazine. Welcome, Eric.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, so let's start off by just hearing your pitch for why this was poorly thought out activism here.
Sure, yeah. Well, I want to say, I admire the, sort of bravery of these activists in terms of, risking arrest for the sake of a cause that they really believed in. I wrote in my piece when I was their age, the only cause I think I risked arrest for was getting stoned in parks. So, more power to them in that respect. But ultimately, I don't think that at this point in time, the challenge for climate change is really about raising awareness, or for that matter, about keeping fossil fuel in the ground, so much as it is about developing clean energy technology that will make it so that there isn't this stark tension between keeping people's heating and electricity bills low and limiting carbon emissions. Because ultimately, as we're seeing right now in the energy crunch, the whole world is going through to an extent, but especially in Europe and South Asia, people ultimately value, their day-to-day material needs more than the threat of climate change, which is very real, but is ultimately for a lot of people sort of abstract and long-term relative to, I can't afford my heating anymore, and so I'm going to shiver at night, or I'm going to have to spend less on groceries, and my kids are going to have to go a little hungry. These concerns come first. There's kind of a hierarchy of needs, as like the psychologist Abraham Maslow said. And so it's just really important to make sure, to keep people invested in the green transition, to make sure that proceeds in a way where people are not materially harmed in the present, especially working class people.
So I completely agree, Eric, that people are being kind of presented with this trade-off of their kind of immediate energy needs and the broader kind of significant structural shifts that are needed to actually address climate change. It's not clear to me that this protest is what's kind of playing on those tensions or even ignoring those tensions as they exist. It seems to me that unless you believe that countries like the UK, where this protest happened, or any other of the overwhelming countries that are overwhelmingly responsible for the bulk of pollution like the United States, unless you believe that they are as committed to doing the most that they have to do to transition to clean energy now, even accepting that in the shorter term, there is going to have to still be a reliance on fossil fuels. Unless you think there is a maximalist, full-fledged approach to that transition, isn't it still useful for climate activists to keep pushing for that amount of investment in a green transition to be pursued? And isn't a protest like this well calculated to put tension on those actors, like the fossil fuel companies that fund this museum, and like the elite patrons who perhaps are more invested in the longevity of the Van Gogh than they are the longevity of the planet?
Yeah, so I think that, do we need more climate activism to try to keep this issue at front and center on the agenda? I think yes. Have these sorts of actions had, a positive impact in terms of influencing elite discourse and moving this issue to the center of those priorities? I think so. But we have to think about, in the current context, two things. One, I think that is our emphasis going to be on limiting the supply of a commodity that is currently in shortage and that people cannot afford, and that people are very concerned about? Natural gas and oil and gasoline prices, these are among the top concerns that voters have. Are we going to identify our movement with limiting this thing that people want more of, or rather are we going to identify it with, in fact, something that provides you the benefit that those fuels do, but without the cost of this terrible pollution, this terrible, impact, not just, on the climate, but also on your lungs, a more sort of positive vision where there is less of a trade-off. Separately from that, you have to think about, in terms of your direct actions, ones that are going to increase support for the cause more than they increase sort of antagonistic feelings towards the movement. There was glass over this Van Gogh. The Van Gogh was not destroyed So I kind of, it's a good piece of performance art to an extent. But, the same group was spending, I think the full previous week blocking traffic in the center of London, which will get people's attention. But to the extent that we don't currently have a mass base that is really mobilized, demanding their government make the changes that we need to see, I don't think that, making people late for work, potentially, getting them in trouble with their bosses, I don't know. It's not clear to me that is going to move the needle the way that we need to.
Yeah, that would be the reaction I would have to it, is that I think if you asked, if you surveyed 100 people, you told them what happened, that they threw soup at this painting without giving the additional context that actually the painting wasn't harmed, et cetera, and here's why they did it. If they just heard about this incident, which most people are not going to follow through on all the nitty-gritty details of it, I assume the majority opinion would be, that's dumb, these people are crazy. So I do take the point of that this is spreading kind of negative attention for a cause, which is not what you want to do. It gains attention, but not necessarily the right kind of attention, I think, very clearly in this.
Well, let's talk about that, though, Robbie. So here are the options. And I remember Tommy Vitor of Pod Save America tweeted something along the lines of, this is something that's calculated to make me less likely to want to support climate change. And I was really struck by that, because so often when leftists are trying to raise concerns about, various kind of framing and the emphasis on certain kinds of weaponized identity politics, et cetera, you get a lot of pushback from the same liberal cohorts that say, if you weren't as invested in these social justice policies because it was attached to X, Y, and Z, then you're really just a racist deep down, and you didn't really care in the first place, and you're not someone we're trying to convince. In this context, everyone seems to be very cavalier about saying, well, this makes me want to pollute harder, even though they really position themselves as genuine supporters of climate policy. I don't know that I believe it's true that anybody who cares about the Green New Deal is going to care about it one mite less than this. And the people who might think this is stupid still don't, it's not going to negatively affect their investment in the climate movement. It is, however, causing a conversation to be happening right now that otherwise wouldn't be happening. What do you make of that, Eric?
Yeah, well, I will say, after I learned about the protest, I went and I took a jug of oil and just poured it on a baby seal because I just couldn't control myself. No, yeah, I think that is a really immature response that some people have had, and I think people mostly don't mean it, but I think that there was just a sense on social media at that point that was kind of a sentiment that people were responding to positively, so people made it. And yeah, look, this conversation would not be happening if they didn't do this. It did, and in the piece that I wrote, I did say this did generate headlines, and this did generate conversation. And I think that all is very valuable. I think that there's a limit to the value of the raising awareness in the current context, and especially around this issue of, keeping it in the ground, because you're just not going to have people more aware or talking about more climate change right now, especially, in Britain, where there's a huge cost of living crisis, than they are going to be talking about their concerns about how much their heating oil is costing them. And so I think that we're in a moment where there's limited returns to the raising awareness, and I think more, focus should be on really solving the problems, the challenges, technological and political, that are keeping us from fully deploying the clean energy technologies we already have, building out solar, building out wind, building transmission lines, and also investing in the technologies that we still don't quite have. Battery storage that makes it so that solar and wind power can generate electricity consistently, not just when the weather cooperates, possibly geothermal energy, nuclear, these other things to provide a more stable source of low carbon energy. I think there's real concrete challenges that we can tackle that will make it easier for us to reconcile the political demands, the short-term political demands from electorates for cheap gasoline, cheap heat, cheap electricity, or at least affordable, and the prerogative to, or the obligation imperative to limit our carbon emissions so that we have a livable planet for our grandchildren.
I'm going to go fish that baby seal out of the barrel of oil that you've casually tried to murder, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Yep, no problem.
More Rising right after this.